Sinjin, these last weeks we were in touch with Ursula Schultz-Domburg, who showed us some of her photographs from the 1980s of inscriptions from Yemen. And you said that you would like to show me something in the collection of the British Museum here in the art room, which is the study room of the Middle East Department. So now I'm here, and I wonder what object you were thinking of, what you wanted to show me.
Well, we're in a room of writing, as you rightly said, and this object was one of the first examples of an ancient South Arabian inscription acquired in the 19th century, when, of course, your predecessors were the principal librarians. We were a museum dominated by books and manuscripts, and we were trying to acquire, as a museum, examples of every script and language from around the world. So this came in 1861. It comes from Aden and was given to us by a political resident called Captain Lambert Playfair. So he was a servant of the British government of India, working in Aden. It's a beautiful location as a port, commanding, as it were, the approaches to the Indian Ocean from the Red Sea and vice versa. Critical to the British government of India for controlling the route, therefore, from India to Egypt and from Egypt to Britain. It's got deep water access on the east and the west, so it can take advantage of the different winds, depending on which way the winds are blowing, and it's fortified from the land. So you can see why the British thought this was a particularly powerful place to hold.
So all of, a major part of what is today Yemen and all of what is today Saudi Arabia was under Turkish control, absolutely. Ottoman control.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who did this stretch of land belong to?
So this belonged to different local sultans, independent rulers. And after Britain acquired Aden, we signed peace treaties with those local sultans and created what was called a protectorate. And so we offered protection to those sultans from anyone else and intervened when there was fighting and disputes between them.
And thus, there was a possibility to control them, actually.
Oh, it works both ways.
Yeah.
And then that situation remained really in effect until the 1930s. So for 100 years, this operated as a very successful symbiosis, in effect, between these local rulers and the British in Aden. So this piece was found in a town called Taiz. Inscriptions were basically reused in modern houses as convenient pieces of stone, as spolia. So unfortunately, we have no idea where the rest of the inscription is, but it's probably lying in Taiz in the foundations of another house.
So originally, do we know what that might have looked like?
So it would have been part of a series of blocks forming a composite, in a sense. And you can see the right-hand edge of it here and the beginnings of 6 lines of inscription, which are in ancient South Arabian script, an alphabetic script, written in the Katabanic language, which is one of the languages of one of the kingdoms of central Yemen. Paleographically, we can now say that this dates to the second half of the first millennium BC. It might not look like very much now, but when we put the light and throw some light on it, you can see it's really quite dramatic.
Now you can really make
imagine that in the bright sun of Yemen.
Yeah. And today, of course, we know what it's a fragment, but we have an idea of what this refers to.
Yes, there's enough to show that there's a personal name along, so the inscription is read from right to left, and there's a personal name about halfway down. So it's the name of somebody who has dedicated this inscription, and it's probably from a temple. So when Playfair writes to Panizzi, he says, I have a small collection of objects, not worthy really of the British Museum, But to give you an idea, I will send you some photographs.
Photographs?
And these are the photographs he sends in 1861.
That's amazing.
These are probably the earliest photographs taken of objects in the Middle East. So Playfair is experimenting with the latest technology. This photograph, as you can see, very faded now, is that very inscription.
That slab, yeah.
And he then attempted to transcribe the inscription into Arabic, because he knew it was a Semitic language. And then he wrote, as I say, to Panizzi. And so we have here, from our central archive in the museum, copies of the letters, the director's correspondence. And here you'll see the letter from Playfair, from the Aden Political Residency, 31st of March 1862. I have the pleasure to acknowledge the receipt of your letter. I fear that you have formed an exaggerated estimate of my collection of Himyaritic inscriptions. The originals in my possession are few in number and hardly worthy of presentation to the British Museum. But I think that the collection of rubbings and photographs of bronzes and inscribed slabs which I have made is unique. So this is one of the first instances of an individual writing to the museum about these discoveries that are being made of an unknown language in southern Arabia.
That's amazing.
You know, for instance, here he says, if the trustees of the British Museum are anxious to obtain a collection of Himyaritic inscriptions and authorise me to send agents in search of them, I shall be happy to use all my influence to ensure success. And thus begins, basically, this process of developing a collection, just as a collection is being developed in Vienna, in Paris, in Constantinople. We see the beginning of the South Arabian collection. And this is triggering then, of course, attempts by scholars to decipher these inscriptions, to read them. And so what we have here are examples of the impact of these discoveries. So here we have...
So that's a printed book, though.
A printed book from our library.
It says inscriptions in the
Himyaritic character.
Now deposited in the British Museum, chiefly discovered in southern Arabia. So within 2 years, between that letter, where he says, I could help you to acquire a collection of these inscriptions.
We've got enough for a catalogue. So there are some descriptions. But, as you can see, just some sample pages here.
Is that slab the one we just looked
well,
at? Is it in
I'm just
here?
going to take you here, because if you remember, there's a number 31 on the frame.
Oh, yeah, here
for
it
those, yeah, there we are.
Wow.
Number 31, that's the piece.
So in fact, yeah, so they took this, transcribed it, then looked at details and said, no, this is not there anymore, so you have to correct it. That's amazing. And did they, at that time, 63, was there a possibility to not only transcribe it, this is beautifully done, but also to
read it, to translate it? No, at this stage they still couldn't. So really it is just a record of the scripts. Mm-hmm. But it didn't take long, because Playfair's successor was a chap called William Prideaux. Mm-hmm. And Prideaux also writes to us. And interestingly, oh yeah, thank you. Interestingly, I think he writes to this department. He writes to the keeper, Samuel Birch. Mm. So what we have here, turn the pages very carefully, are some letters from Prideaux to Birch, Samuel Birch, the keeper of the Oriental Antiquities section of the British Museum, the section that is effectively the forerunner of this department, which specialised in inscriptions. Yeah. And so you can see that Prideaux here is actually copying inscription after inscription that he's noting coming into Aden. And where he can, acquiring them for this museum.
And almost scholarly work on these objects.
So Prideaux was what we might say Britain's first Sabaeologist, Britain's first specialist of ancient South Arabian
languages.
He was a scholar. I mean, he was self-taught, but I think he had enough experience, enough contacts with Birch and with particularly German scholars. And so he gave a paper here, published in the Transactions of the Society of Biblical Archaeology, 1877. And the paper is entitled A Sketch of Sabaean Grammar with Examples of Translation. So he does a comparative alphabet with Phoenician on the left, Hebrew, Sabaean, Ethiopic, Arabic, and then the English equivalent.
That's extraordinary.
Can only be filled with admiration for these chaps because this is not their day job. This is being done in the evenings and at the weekends and as a personal passion. Really.
So this came out in, what did you say?
1877.
1877, and here there are attempts at translating.
It. Yeah. So of course, the discipline has moved on a lot since 1877, and these translations are not very reliable. But nevertheless, it's this process of dissemination, understanding, and in a sense, doing what we do here in the museum all the time. In a sense, is research, display, disseminate. But here is somebody who is doing it, in his own time as a British officer in Aden. In the correspondence from Prideaux, a remarkable moment where we have another individual. So if we go past these letters, we have here, Aden, 21st of July, 1871. My dear sir, I received a few days ago a note from Sharif Ali bin Hussein, the chief of Abu Uraish in Yemen, enclosing the accompanying copies of some inscriptions found in his district. They were found near a village called Al-Himma, in a watercourse called the Wadi Ras Thand, and appear to be rough fragmentary scrawls, probably scribbled by travellers through the watercourse when it was dry. Nothing can be made of them. So Prideaux is a little bit dismissive, but historically they are extraordinary because these are the first attempts by a Yemeni to copy ancient South Arabian inscriptions in the territory of modern Yemen.
That's extraordinary.
And even more extraordinary is the fact that Prideaux himself says they were engraved on large boulders which my informant states are too heavy for a camel to carry. So these are still there in that wadi, awaiting rediscovery one day when somebody can identify exactly where it is. You've got Antonio Panizzi, who's receiving these letters and these donations from British officers in Aden, invoking the Copyright Act to make sure there's a copy of every single book published in Britain held here in the British Museum. It's all part and parcel of the same jigsaw, that knowledge is power and inscriptions give you that knowledge.
But that the museum is also a place where this knowledge is ideally freely accessible to everyone.
It's at the heart of our DNA, in a sense.
Yeah.